April 1945. The war in Europe is nearly over. For 10 individuals who live through the chaos and the horror, these final 10 days will shape the rest of their lives. The Western Allies have swept through Germany and Italy, destroying the fascist Axis. The Soviet army has hacked its way to the heart of Berlin and is about to take Hitler's government house. Russian hordes rampage through the streets, terrorizing the inhabitants. Hiding in his bunker beneath the devastated city, Hitler is not only losing the war, he's losing his mind. Intelligence reports say he plans to continue the war from his fortress in the Alps. While Eisenhower sends troops to the mountains, a new threat looms in the north. The Russians occupy Eastern Europe and are now marching on Denmark. British troops race north to cut them off. The next 10 days will change their lives and the world forever. 29th of April, 9 days to victory. The Germans still hold Western Holland in their deadly grip. They have cut off all food supplies to punish the inhabitants for aiding the Allies. Each day, nearly 1,000 people die of starvation. Today, the German command in Holland will finally agree to allow the Allied airlift to bring in food to relieve the famine. At Royal Air Force bases in England, Lancaster bombers prepare for takeoff. In their bomb bays, they carry food for the starving Dutch. But while the Germans have agreed to a temporary truce, they still demand total control over the situation. No one is certain they won't simply shoot down any Allied aircraft flying in over occupied Holland. 21-year-old Flight Lieutenant John Curry is with 460 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force. As he prepares to take off for Holland, he doesn't know whether he's on a flight of mercy or a suicide mission.
The truce had been arranged. The papers weren't signed until May the 2nd, so that the first 3 flights were really without the Germans' agreement on paper. Germans naturally were concerned about the situation of having 300 Lancs come in from the sea. They didn't know whether it was going to be an airborne invasion, a trick to conquer or at least to put them down.
The Germans place anti-aircraft guns near each of the 4 food drop zones. If the Allies start dropping bombs instead of food, they're ready.
The drop site was indicated by a large white cross with green flares. The only way to let these food go was to open the bomb bay doors. That was not a very precise method of dropping anything. And I remember thinking as we approached the drop site, some of these people are going to be hit because they've got more faith in our aiming skill than we have with the method we were using. And there were people hit.
In all, 242 Allied bombers dropped more than 500 tons of food over Holland on the first day alone. Thousands more will be needed as the Nazis continue to starve their opponents. That same day, American paratrooper Clancy Lyle and his comrades in Easy Company are sweeping and securing a small town outside Munich.
Is anybody there? We're Americans. Ich bin Amerikaner.
We heard rumors, you know, that they have concentration camps, and here we see these human skeletons. They just looked, you know, like a ghost looking at you. It was the sickest thing I ever saw in my life. We also saw hundreds of bodies piled up on one corner. What the Germans did, they shot as many as they could, and they left before we got there. between the stench and them crying and all that stuff, man, I don't care who you are. I had tears in my eyes. I never seen anything like this in my life.
The appalling brutality of the Nazi concentration camp profoundly shakes the battle-hardened paratroopers.
The worst thing for me, I would think, it made you think that, my God, how could God let this happen? You know, it tests of faith, but of course, I never lost my faith. I don't think any of us ever did. But how could people do that? You know, you had to be an animal to do things like that. And some of the SS were animals, and they enjoyed doing that. What I saw there, I could never get that out of my mind, never, ever. I prayed about it and everything else, but it won't leave.
Well, by the 29th of April, the Reich is crumbling. German forces in Italy finally sign an unconditional surrender, but to the Western Allies, who will now administer the post-war settlement. As far as Germany and Austria are concerned, their post-war zones of occupation were agreed by the Allies at the Yalta Conference in February.
In February 1945, the three main allies, the USA, Britain and Russia, met at Yalta to decide the fate of post-Nazi Europe. The Soviets get the eastern sectors of both Berlin and Vienna.
And yet the cities of Berlin, Prague and Vienna can be taken by whoever gets there first. Stalin, of course, is determined that his troops will take all the capitals, and he doesn't mind the cost.
Stalin can still strip the assets of each city before retreating into his agreed occupation zone. In Berlin, the Russians' target, the Reichstag, is finally in sight. They're under pressure to take it before the May Day parade in Moscow. If Vasily Ustugov can hoist the red flag on its roof, his name will be immortalized. But the city is being defended to the death, even by boys as young as 12. The SS hang anyone who refuses to fight.
И оказалось так, что наверху вот этих зданий высоких были
There were a lot of German soldiers on top of the buildings.
довольно солидные, а мы оказались внизу. И когда утром 20...
When we started to move towards the river Spree on the morning of April 29th, they opened fire and hit us really badly.
Они нас сверху здорово побили.
Vasily Ustugov and his men are on the move, night and day. Severely exhausted, they become easy targets for German snipers.
Our battalion commander was killed. He'd been with us from the very beginning of the war. Our division and regimental chief signal officers were both killed. We suffered big losses because it was really easy for the Germans to shoot at us from above.
Если так рисоваться, там, как некоторые допускают, что я вот такой храбрый, так, ничего не боюсь. Там,
Of course I was afraid. But when we were preparing for an attack, we were ready for anything.
мы были готовы к любому исходу.
You could get wounded or killed.
Можешь и ранен, и убить, и можешь и уцелеть, так сказать, это. Я там бил прямой наводкой.
Many times when I was firing at others, I was hit. It only takes a moment. Your cannon is smashed. Your men are lying dead around you. You're wounded and bleeding. It's a matter of seconds. We were ready for anything. But even though we were exhausted, we were never indifferent. We wanted to live, but we knew we had to do our job, especially on April 30th. We were at the center of Berlin, next to the Reichstag, on the eve of the May Day celebrations. The radio, the morale officers, everything was telling us that the whole country was holding its breath.
After battling across hundreds of miles to get to Berlin, this final short sprint to the Reichstag is the most dangerous ground Vasily Ustugov will ever cross. 29th of April, 9 days to victory. After a week of vicious fighting, the Russians now occupy most of Berlin. In the evening, they go looking for the spoils of war. The remaining residents of Gerda's apartment block seek safety in numbers. They crowd into her small dining room, while Gerda and her sister keep out of sight.
Здорово, бабоньки. Ну что, поживем? Покушали что-нибудь, а? Кушай! Еда! Еда! Ну что ты? Что ты боишься? А? Ну что ты? Нету, да, ничего? А? Ух ты! Петруха! Старая знакомая, а? Мама где? Ну? Где мама? Ты звони, не помню. Где мама? Мама! Что ты мой маленький? Что там? Что? Что? Где? Что ты? Ладно, смотри, на, не бойся. Так, ты, пойдем со мной. Не бойся, все хорошо. Так, ты, пойдем со мной. Ты что, не поняла, дура? Давай, сюда! Давай, сюда! Давай! Быстро!
There are soldiers everywhere. They can only escape to the deserted floor above and hope the balcony is the last place the Russians will look. The baby's crying, which had saved them the night before, now puts them in great danger. They have to find some way to quiet the child, and quickly. Then Gerda remembers the rations she looted from the train.
Every time when our baby wanted to cry, he put the small mort cushions and in her mouth, and she was quiet then. But I heard everything what happened in our home, in our house. And there was a friend of mine, the same age as I, and I heard her crying and crying, and it was so awful because it was in my room, in my bedroom, it happened. And I heard her crying, and I heard her crying my name. I was so afraid that some soldier could come upstairs to us there, and if one would have come, I was just ready to jump down. No one could have touched me. I was ready to jump down. And some of neighbors across the street and so, they have done this. Friends of my sister, she jumped down with her little son. And this was the worst night I ever had, yes. And I never forget it.
'30th of April, 8 days to victory. The Russians are in Berlin. They have taken Vienna and are closing in on the Czechoslovakian capital, Prague.
Churchill's still urging Eisenhower to get to Prague before the Russians, but Eisenhower, under orders from the American Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, isn't prepared to suffer any casualties. In his opinion, Prague doesn't have a military value, and so General Patton is ordered to advance only as far as the Czech border, when he could have actually been in Prague within 24 hours.
All over Eastern Europe, Germany's iron grip is being replaced by the Soviets. But to the west, the full extent of the Nazi evil comes as a horrendous shock. A few miles outside Munich, paratrooper Clancy Lyle oversees the local townspeople cleaning up a place they claimed didn't exist.
Move it!
The concentration camp lay right under their noses. Yet the residents of Buchloe say they didn't know it was there.
And the people in the area had to know, because those people was out on their farms working for them. They had to see the column of smoke. They had to know what was going on. But it's the first time they had to grab hold of these corpses. And the first time they had to bathe these walking skeletons. You know, man, women, whatever, they had to bathe them. And you could see that they was shaking like this, crying like they got caught. That's what it was. And they tried to, you know, repent. I repented out, you know, that's crap. But it was a really marked difference. When we first went into town there, they had the flags out, the white flags out and all this stuff. Kept aloof, kept away from you, stuff like that. Now all of a sudden, oh, please forgive me, all that, you know. Their philosophy turned right around after they had to go into the camp. So I had no pity for those people.
There is little pity for the Germans in Berlin. During the day, the Soviet soldiers are busy fighting, but in the evening, they get drunk. Then they go looking for loot and women.
The Russian soldiers went from cellar to cellar, from house to house. On our side, there was a butcher, and his daughter was only 14 years old. And next day we heard that she was shot down because when the Russian soldier wanted to come with him, so she gave him and then he took his gun and shot her down. My mother said, we cannot stay here anymore in this house. We'll go to a friend of my sister, some streets away, and we could stay there the next days, because this house there, this could be closed. It was not damaged, and there have been more men in the house who watched every night and called then Kommissar, Kommissar. They always said, if you call Kommissar, Kommissar, then the Soviet soldiers stop it. So.
Berlin is only hours away from falling to the Russians. They have now fought their way to the very steps of the Reichstag, only a short distance from Hitler's bunker. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere is tense and bleak. There's no day or night. People live in a continual twilight zone, unable to sleep. They speak in whispers. Hitler is terrified of being taken alive. He is determined not to suffer the same humiliating fate as Mussolini. Telephone operator Rokas Misch and the rest of the bunker staff are all too aware that the closer the Soviets get, the closer Hitler is to taking his own life.
Everybody was already half dead. It was very close to the end. I don't know if you can imagine what those days were like. The lack of sleep, the feelings of things coming to an end.
That same morning of April 30th, General Weidling informs the Führer that the city's garrison is running out of food and ammunition, with resistance to the Russians collapsing, and his own head of the SS and Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler, offering to surrender to the Allies. Hitler feels betrayed and depressed. He knows now the war is lost. That afternoon, Hitler says goodbye to his staff. Then at about 3 o'clock, looking old and haggard, he retires to his study with his young wife. As the minutes tick by, a tense, anxious silence fills the bunker.
We knew he would shoot himself. Everybody was waiting to see whether they could hear the shot. And then somebody called out, "I think the time has come." I didn't hear the shot, but someone must have heard it, and when they made the call, everything went quiet. It was quiet for a few minutes. Then we wanted to see what had happened. I can't remember who opened the door. But when the door was opened, I wanted to see. I went over a few paces to the right, and there I could see how Hitler had fallen, and Eva Braun was next to him on the sofa. She was wearing a dark blue dress with white sequins.
Hitler shot himself in the head as he bit down on a cyanide capsule. For Eva, the cyanide was enough.
After I saw it, I ran away, but I became frightened and confused and ran back. As I came back, I could see how Hitler was being wrapped in blankets on the floor. And then I saw, I can't remember whether it was Hitler or Eva Braun who was carried out first. Then I ran away. I went to the commander of our unit in the new Reich Chancellery and made my report. The Führer is dead. Nothing mattered anymore. Nothing mattered. All I can remember doing is closing the large handles of the steel doors. Then I became frightened. I knew this was concrete. How would I get out of here? Could I get out?
Adolf Hitler and his bride of only 36 hours are then taken outside by his staff, doused in petrol and burnt in a bomb crater. The enemy will not be able to display or defile his corpse. Now it's up to his successor, the new Führer, Grand Admiral Dönitz, to try and stop the massacre and the complete destruction of Berlin. Just after 6 o'clock that evening, Vasily Ustugov and his comrades in the 150th Rifle Division force their way into the main hall of the Reichstag. The fighting is ferocious and intense, the casualties high.
It was a huge, dark building. There wasn't even a single candle in there. If you try to get somewhere in the dark, you risk being killed by your own men. It's easier to kill your own troops in the dark than the enemy. Things like that happen to the Russians and the Germans alike. It's very difficult to know where you are and who is in front of you in a dark city.
The Russian soldiers have only one goal: to fly their flag from the Reichstag, the heart and soul of Nazi Germany.
There were 3 flags. The first was carried by Sergeant Pyatnitsky, who was killed on the steps of the Reichstag. It was picked up by another soldier. The second flag was carried by Lieutenant Sorokin and his men. And the last one was of our battalion.
Just before 11 p.m. on the 30th of April 1945, the capital of Hitler's Third Reich is officially under a Russian flag. But the biggest war in history is not over yet. It is May the 1st, 1945. 7 days to victory. Hitler is dead. Berlin has fallen to the communists in time for May Day. The city has yet to officially surrender, but there is only one question on everyone's mind. Could this be the end of the war?
Dass unser Führer Adolf Hitler heute Nachmittag in seinem Befehlsstand in der Reichskanzlei bis zum letzten Atemzuge gegen den Bolschewismus kämpft, mit dem Willen, den
Mutter,
Kampf gegen die
der
Bolschewisten
Führer
so
ist
lange
tot.
fortzusetzen.
Es ist aus. Der Krieg ist aus, nicht wahr?
Grand Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's successor, issues a communique to the nation, saying that it is his duty to save them from the communists. He orders the utmost resistance.
Es ist nicht aus.
I had no future. I remember I was standing there and I thought, I never will laugh again. This was my feeling. And I didn't know what will come, what kind of future can I have. I was really helpless.
Well, as soon as the news of Hitler's death reaches the Allies, they concentrate all their efforts on negotiating an unconditional surrender with his successor, Grand Admiral Dönitz. But Dönitz can't be contacted, and in any case, he's only interested in surrendering to the Western Allies so as to save as much of Germany as possible from Russian occupation.
In Hitler's bunker 15 meters below the ruins of Berlin, German Chief of Staff General Krebs has just been to see the Russian commander, General Zhukov, for the second time to request a ceasefire. Zhukov rejected him. He will only accept an unconditional surrender of all German forces. Krebs cannot conceive of being taken alive by the Soviets. Suicide is the only option. Only a few now remain in the bunker. Hitler's telephone operator, Roke Smish, is one of them.
Even though I was tired and numb, and I didn't care what happened, I pulled out a pistol in case I had to shoot myself.
Well,
if you see all this death, Hitler dead, Eva Braun dead, Krebs dead, you become indifferent. I could not leave my post. I was a soldier, I had to stay here. If I ran away, they would shoot me as a deserter.
Even after Hitler's death, reports keep coming in of SS troops gathering at Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. Paratrooper Clancy Lyle and Easy Company are on their way to engage these hardened Nazi forces. They pass scores of defeated German troops, trying to make their way to the west.
Even coming down the shorter roads, nothing but mass Germans surrendered, marching in lockstep down the road. Quite a few. That was a good sight. I mean, as far as you could see was Germans. You know?
The Nazi Empire is spiraling into chaos. Everywhere, German forces are trying to secure a separate peace with the Western Allies. They simply cannot face surrendering to the Russians, whom they consider inferior, and who will no doubt torture them and condemn them to hard labor in Siberia.
They didn't want the Russians because, you know, what they did, they knew what happened in Russia. They did horrific things through Russia. So if I was a Russian, I'd be damn sure I was going to do some damage to them too. All of them.
The 2nd of May, 6 days to victory. The Allies receive news that the Russian army has taken Rostock on the Baltic. They are rapidly closing in on Denmark, from where they can control the entire region. Now it isn't just a matter of ending the war, it's how it will end. The next few days will determine the shape of Europe for generations to come.
Churchill receives reports of parachutists landing in the vicinity of Copenhagen. And for this reason, he's absolutely desperate for Montgomery to get to the Baltic first, so as to stop the Russians getting into Denmark.
On the 2nd of May, Montgomery's forces take the city of Hamburg. Commando Cliff Morris and his comrades are making the final push to Denmark. British forces finally reach the Baltic and seal off the Danish peninsula a mere 6 hours before the Russians get there. The Western Allies have kept the Soviets out of Denmark and northwest Germany.
Montgomery quickly establishes an eastern flank from the Baltic to the Elbe. The roads around here, of course, are crowded with thousands of troops and refugees pouring towards the west, trying to escape the Russian advance. British forces meet whole German units, complete with arms and equipment, trying to surrender. And during the 2nd and 3rd of May, Montgomery's men take 500,000 prisoners.
At 3 p.m. on the same day, the Berlin garrison finally surrenders unconditionally to the Red Army. The ferocious 2-week battle for the German capital has cost the Russians over 300,000 casualties. The Germans suffer well over 100,000 dead and injured, with a further 480,000 taken prisoner. Beneath the carnage in Hitler's bunker, only a skeleton crew remain. They include the Nazi propaganda minister Josef Goebbels, the bunker's engineer, and the telephonist Rochus Misch.
We were the last government, as it were, the three of us. It was over. I said to Goebbels, "What is there left to do?" He then said I could go. We knew how to live, so we will also know how to die. So then I pulled out all the cables, everything in sockets, and nobody could reach us anymore.
Rochus Misch then finally leaves the coffin-like bunker for the last time. A few minutes later, Goebbels shoots himself. His wife has already poisoned their 6 children and then killed herself. The bunker has become a ghastly testimonial to the Nazis' evil madness. That same afternoon, Montgomery finally receives the message he's long been waiting for. The commander of all northern German forces facing him is prepared to surrender. Montgomery might think the war is finished, but it's not over yet for paratrooper Clancy Lyle and Easy Company. They approach the mountains, uncertain about what might be waiting for them.
I didn't know if any time they're going to come around the mountains. And, they know the mountains. They're Alpine troops, number 1, number 2. They know where every little hole is. So it's like real warfare. You don't know till you step on it, right? So I always stayed in my mind. You walk down the street, you got 9 eyes all around the place. I've still got back in my mind what I'm going to face, what I thought I was going to face anyway. So we was briefed that we was going to take these people on.
Third of May, 5 days to victory. For the most part, the Russians have left the suburbs for the center of Berlin. Gerda and her family venture back to their apartment. Nothing can prepare them for what the Russians have done to their home.
believe it. The bathroom, the bath was filled. My sister said, I can't live here anymore. Her sleeping room was full of candle lights. The baby bed was damaged and all full of. You can't believe it.
But Berlin is not the only city that's been sacrificed to the Red Army.
Down in Czechoslovakia, meanwhile, the Germans are still fiercely resisting Russian attacks from both the north and the east. And General Patton's US Third Army threatens to attack from the west. Patton, of course, wants to liberate Prague, but the American Chief of Staff, General Marshall, tells Eisenhower to leave Prague to the Russians. Of course, another decision which will haunt Eisenhower for years to come.
Fourth of May, 4 days to victory. Paratrooper Clancy Lyle and Easy Company move ever closer to a deadly showdown in the mountains with the fanatical SS. The silence is menacing. They could be driving into a trap. Their nerves are on edge.
Yeah, sure, it's scared. I don't care how big and bold and bad you think you are, you know, you still got, if you're not like this, you're crazy. You had no business being there, you know. But yeah, we all had the same idea that Jesus, so close into the war. I hope I get through this, you know. I expected to fire a lot of guerrilla pockets, you know, hit and run ambushes on you, know, stuff like that. It's pure guerrilla warfare. You come out behind trees or top of trees all over the place. You don't know where they are.
Meanwhile, in the north, just after 5 p.m., a delegation of top German officials visit Field Marshal Montgomery. The day before, he refused their offer to surrender only to the west. Today, they sign an unconditional surrender of all forces facing him in northern Germany. The surrender is signed at 6:30 p.m. and comes into effect the following day, the 5th of May, at 8 a.m.
This was really the sort of pinnacle of his career, in a way. I mean, here was he, having started as a very junior officer in 1908, when he was commissioned from Sandhurst, receiving the surrender of 2 million of the nation's enemies. So it was a really moving occasion for him.
News of the capitulation hasn't reached the front lines. Commando Cliff Morris and his comrades are preparing to capture the Baltic port of Kiel. In a couple of days, he'll be out of a job. He writes in his diary.
Today we have passed through Lübeck and have finally arrived at Neustadt, where we are staying in large marine barracks which were used for living quarters by camp staff. This time it has been a walkover and a joy trip for us. White flags were hanging everywhere and Jerry troops were surrendering in their thousands.
While the war staggers to an end all over Europe, Paratrooper Clancy Lyle and his comrades in Easy Company must still complete their dangerous mission in the mountains. "5th of May, 3 days to victory. In the ruins of the German capital, there's hardly any food left. Its inhabitants have been reduced to eating whatever they can find. People are forced to sell whatever they have left in order to buy what little is still available. Even bread is scarce and expensive. 2 slices must last a whole day. While the Russians ransack Berlin, its people are starving.
Entschuldigen Sie. Bitte.
That same morning of the 5th of May, Flight Lieutenant John Curry of the Royal Australian Air Force returns to his base in England. It's his third food drop to Holland this week. With up to 500 drops a day, the Allied pilots have managed to save thousands of grateful Dutch people from the German-imposed famine.
They could sense then that they were going to be liberated very soon. They really went wild, excited, and they were on the roofs and waving through the top stories of, you know, the old Dutch buildings are 3 or 4 stories, and you'd see these people up on the top stories waving their things. It was a great feeling. You could almost feel it, you know, coming from the ground, and the appreciation that they were showing.
During the 10 days of the airlift, over 11,000 tons of food are delivered to Holland. But for many, it is too late. Some 20,000 people still die of starvation.
Well, on the 5th of May, the German occupation of Holland comes to an end. General Blaskowitz, the German commander-in-chief, finally surrenders in the presence of Prince Bernhard. And after 5 years of occupation, Amsterdam is also liberated. Today, the first British victory salvo of the war is fired at Montgomery's headquarters as the ceasefire in northern Germany and Denmark comes into force. All over Europe, German armies are collapsing.
When I arrived at Merchant's Garden, I was apprehensive, scared. The war's about over and I want to live, you know, so you put extra senses out there. Really thought there was going to be a shootout there, but they all had their little white flags out there, but that don't mean nothing, you know, real quiet. But, you know, when it's real quiet, you worry more, there's a lot of noise.
Paratrooper Clancy Lyle and Easy Company reach their final destination.
This is way too quiet. Might be a trap.
They have endured 11 months of relentless combat since D-Day. This is their last mission. They must get through it alive. Against all expectations, they take Hitler's mountain retreat without firing a shot. With no last stand in the Alps, is this at last the final gasp of the dying Nazi regime? th of May, 1945. At 2 a.m., 2 powerful Nazis, General Jodl and General Admiral von Friedeberg, arrive at Allied headquarters. The day before, Eisenhower refused their offer to surrender only to the West. Today they have instructions from Grand Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's successor, to sign the unconditional surrender of all German forces. This confirms the total defeat of the Third Reich. It is signed by representatives of each of the Allied countries. All hostilities will cease at 1 minute past 11 p.m. on the 8th of May, 1945. World War II in Europe is officially over. News of the end of the war is greeted with riotous celebrations in the Allied and liberated countries. The Russians sign the German surrender a day later, and on the 9th of May, Stalin declares the war is over. And just as it was foreshadowed on the 25th of April, an iron curtain then comes down, dividing Germany and Europe in half. The Cold War is about to begin.
Well, the Third Reich is no more, but for the inhabitants of Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe, it might seem as if they've simply exchanged one totalitarian overlord for another. Montgomery and Churchill, of course, are horrified. They both believe they won the war but lost the peace. And even in the hour of victory, Churchill's filled with foreboding, and he writes later, the Soviet menace, or so it seemed to me, had already replaced the Nazi foe.
For Gerda Pettersson and many East Europeans, life under the Soviets is one of hardship and repression.
So I had to work in a military hospital, carry dead babies away, and I had to clean, and it was a hard time as long as the Russians have been in our part of Berlin.
But on the 8th of May, 1945, the future seems bright and free of the dangers and deprivations of the last 6 years. The horrors of the war are past, and people can get on with their lives. General Eisenhower goes on to become the 34th President of the United States. He dies in 1969. Field Marshal Montgomery is given the title First Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He's then appointed Deputy Commander of NATO. He dies in 1976. Flight Lieutenant John Curry returns to Australia after the war, where he works as a reporter and then in public service. He lives in Perth, Western Australia.
It was a sort of very mixed feelings when it ended, because we'd been training for 3 or 4 years and the match was called off. You know, it was sort of, it was a bit of a shock. You were out of a job.
Commando Cliff Morris returns to England in 1945 and enjoys a successful career as a boxer, as well as working in the baking industry. He lives in West Sussex, in the south of England. After the war, Italian partisan Urbano Lazzaro moves to Brazil. Many years later, he's now back in Italy and lives in Piemonte. American paratrooper Clancy Lyle goes on to fight in Korea and Vietnam. He lives in Maryland in the USA.
I stayed in the service, so the only thing saved me was the Korea War. It brought me back to reality again, you know. But we had a lot of people that just couldn't make it.
German Army telephonist Rokas Misch is tortured and interrogated in Moscow before serving as a witness at the Nuremberg trials. He's then sent to Siberia for 9 years. He now lives in Berlin. Russian gunner Vasily Ustugov stays on in Berlin as part of the Soviet occupying force until 1946. He retires from the Red Army a lieutenant general in 1985. He lives in Moscow. Canadian Captain Farley Mowat goes on to become Canada's most widely read author. He publishes an autobiographical account of the war in 1992. He lives in Port Hope, Canada.
The war is an act of absolute lunacy. Not just partial lunacy, but absolute lunacy. And it may be the most distinguishing feature of the human species as an animal, that we are subject to this terrible, terrible kind of lunacy. From which the ultimate conclusion that I drew, and I have retained it, is that it is probably the symptom or symbol or diagnostic indication of the way we are going to end.
When the Americans finally arrive in Berlin in July 1945, Gerda Pettersson is relieved to discover that her home is in the American sector. But she falls in love with and marries a doctor from East Berlin and lives there through the long, hard years of the Cold War until Germany's reunification. She and her husband still live in Berlin.